When I realized the man beside me had been dead for at least 10 minutes, and that I had kept firing next to his body without even noticing, I understood something I would never be able to forget. In Stalingrad, death stopped being an event. It became part of the landscape, like the snow, like the smoke, like the taste of gunpowder that would not leave the back of my throat. My name is Wilhelm Faber. If you are reading this, it means I finally managed to write down what I kept buried for more than 50 years. I am not a historian. I cannot explain maps, operations, or the names of every division that fought in that city beside the Volga. I only know what a 22-year-old corporal from Regimento de Infanteria 194 of the 71A División de Infanteria could see from inside a trench, from inside a ruined building, from inside his own fear. Before all of it, I was the son of a baker in a small town near Dresden. I used to wake up at 4 in the morning to help my father light the oven. My hands were rough from flour and heat, not from blood and iron. I had a girlfriend named Anna, who worked in a fabric shop, and a younger brother, Peter, who dreamed of becoming an engineer. I never dreamed of being a soldier. I became one, like almost everyone else, because there was no real choice left to make. I arrived near Stalingrad in August of 1942, inside a freight train that smelled of engine oil and sweat. I still remember the last night before we saw the city. The sky was clear, the stars seemed too close, and an older comrade, a sergeant named Brandt, told me this would be the final campaign. That after this, the war would be practically decided. He believed it. For a while, I believed it too. On August 23rd, I watched the sky turn into something else. The Luftwaffe bombed the city with an intensity I had never imagined possible. Wave after wave of aircraft came over us, the drone of their engines so constant it became a kind of reversed silence. A silence made entirely of noise. The city, which until then I knew only from photographs and rumours, became a fire visible from miles away. The tanks of the 16er Division Panzer reached the Volga soon afterward, north of the city, and for one moment, crows made of smoke seemed to be the only living things on the horizon. I remember thinking, as I watched it from a distance, if this is only the beginning, what is still waiting for us? It did not take long to find out. We entered the city through the southern streets, near the workers' districts, where the factories kept running even under fire. Volgogrado. At the time, Stalingrad was not like the other cities I had seen in Polonia or Franza. It was long, stretched along the river, packed with enormous factories. The Fabbrica de Trattores Dzerzhinsky, the Fabbrica Barricadi, the Fabbrica Ottobre Vermelho. They were names I learned to fear, because each one became a battlefield of its own, a small hell inside the larger one. That was where I learned what the Soviet soldiers called Rattenkrieg, the war of rats. No one had prepared me for that. In Franza, we could advance miles in a single day. In Stalingrad, it could take us an entire week to capture one floor of one building. And sometimes, when we finally took that floor, we discovered the Soviets were still on the floor below, or in the basement, or behind a wall that looked solid but hid a hole dug during the night. The first time I fought hand-to-hand was inside a destroyed apartment building near the central square. I had an entrenching shovel in my hand because my rifle had jammed. I will not describe what happened in detail. I still cannot, even after all these years. But I can say that when I came out of that room, I was no longer the same young man who had left my father's bakery. Would I survive another day of that? The question became a constant companion, like a second breath. There was a man in my company named Hans Gruber, a young fellow from Baviera, funny, always ready with a joke, even when food was short or the cold started biting through our clothes. Hans had a habit of softly whistling a tune I never recognized while cleaning his weapon. He said it calmed him. I did not know then how much longer I would be lucky enough to hear that whistle. September dragged itself through the city like a slow illness. We gained a few yards, then lost just as many. Soviet snipers became an almost supernatural presence. We did not see them, but we felt them in every street we crossed at a run, in every window we avoided looking at for too long. A story spread among us about one especially skilled Soviet sniper who had supposedly killed dozens of our officers and observers. I cannot say whether it was true or just the exaggeration of frightened soldiers, but the fear that story caused was very real. One night, Brandt, the sergeant who had told me the war was almost won, was hit by shrapnel while we were trying to cross a courtyard between two buildings. He did not die right away. He lay there in the middle of the courtyard, moaning softly, and no one could reach him because a sniper had that courtyard covered. We listened to him for almost 2 hours until the sound stopped. No one said anything afterward. What was there to say? It was around that time that I received the first letter from Anna. She did not know, of course, exactly where I was. The censors would never allow that kind of information through. But she wrote about simple things. About autumn arriving early that year. About my brother Peter studying for an exam. About my father's bakery, which was still running with less and less flour. I must have read that letter 20 times, sitting in a basement that smelled of mould and burned gunpowder. And for a few minutes I was able to remember that there was still a world outside those ruins. I kept that letter inside the inner pocket of my coat, close to my chest, where I also kept a small photograph of Anna, already creased and worn at the edges from being touched so often. There were nights when I would take out the photograph just to look at her face for a few seconds, by the weak light of a candle or a hidden fire, and then put it away again carefully, as if that scrap of paper were the last solid thing I had left in the world. A younger comrade, a recruit named Dieter, who had arrived in Russia only a few weeks earlier, once asked me why I did that every night. I did not know how to answer him properly. I only said that as long as I could still remember her face clearly, some part of me was still somewhere other than that city. Where would Hans be now, 3 weeks after that day? Still alive, still whistling. By October, things had gotten worse around the tractor factory and the Barricade factory. We heard that the Soviets were still bringing reinforcements across the Volga at night, in barges and small boats, under artillery fire and air attacks. During the day, the river looked almost peaceful. At night, it became an artery that kept feeding the resistance on the other side, no matter how hard we tried to cut it off. It left me with a strange feeling. No matter how far we advanced, no matter how many streets we took, the city never seemed to truly fall. Before that, still in September, I had taken part in one of the fights that marked me the most. The battle for the city's great grain elevator, a concrete structure so tall it seemed impossible to destroy, even under constant bombing. A small group of Soviet soldiers, surrounded and with no hope of reinforcement, held out inside for days, without water, almost out of ammunition, while we tried and failed to take that structure floor by floor. I remember the heat of the concrete, still warm from the fires of the previous days, and the smell of burned grain mixed with gunpowder, sweet and bitter at the same time, a smell I would still recognize anywhere in the world. When we finally entered the elevator, we found only a few survivors, all starving, some barely able to stand, but none of them had raised their hands until the last bullet had been spent. I remember looking at those men and thinking, if the enemy resists like this, what else is waiting for us in this city? That was also the month when I first heard about Mamayev Kurgan, a hill that overlooked much of the city, and that, according to the rumours moving through the ranks, had changed hands more times than anyone could count. They said the soil of that hill was so mixed with metal fragments that even when the snow melted the following spring, the ground would remain black, burned, unable to grow grass for years. I never fought directly on that hill, but I could see it in the distance, a dark outline against the grey sky, and I knew that right then, at that exact moment, other men like me were living through the same hell I was living in the lower streets of the city. One afternoon, near what remained of an old theatre, we spotted a building the Soviet soldiers had fortified for weeks, an apartment block turned into a small fortress, surrounded by trenches and barbed wire, almost impossible to take. The men called it the Sergeant's House, after a Soviet sergeant who, according to the stories, had been defending the building with a small group for longer than anyone thought possible. We passed near it several times, and we never managed to capture it. That taught me something about that battle. It was not a war of entire armies simply crashing into each other. It was a war of small groups of men, each one refusing to let go of the piece of concrete beneath his feet. November arrived with the first real cold. At first, it was only harsher nights, a wind that cut straight through the coat. Then came the snow, thin at first, almost beautiful, covering the rubble as if trying to hide what lay underneath. I remember thinking that if it kept getting colder, winter would become a worse enemy than the Soviets. I did not yet know how right that thought was. On November 19th, we began hearing strange rumours from the lines north and south of the city. Rumours that the Romanians protecting our flanks were being hit by a massive force of Soviet tanks. At first, no one paid much attention. War is made of rumours, and most of them never prove true. But this time, the rumours did not stop. They grew worse every day. There was something different in the air that week. A more experienced officer, a lieutenant named Kruger, said quietly to a few of us, while we shared a tin of food near a small fire hidden among the ruins, "If they close the ring at Kalach, we're trapped here." No one answered. No one wanted to say out loud what that meant. On November 23rd, the news arrived like a weight dropping onto all of us at once. Soviet forces had linked up near Kalach, closing a huge circle around the entire Sexta Exercito. According to the numbers moving through the ranks, there were more than 200,000 of us trapped inside that circle, along with all our artillery, our vehicles, our horses, and less food every day. Is there still a way out? That question, which once haunted only individual firefights, now hung over the entire city. Rumours spread that Marechal von Manstein was organising a relief army outside the encirclement to rescue us. There were also rumours that the Luftwaffe would be able to supply us by air until help arrived. I clung to those reports the way a drowning man clings to a branch in a fast-moving river. We had nothing else to hold on to. The air supply began, but it was never enough. The transport planes, the old Junkers 52s, tried to land on runways that were shorter and more dangerous every day, under Soviet anti-aircraft fire, and through snowstorms that sometimes lasted for days. We needed 700 tons of supplies a day, according to what we heard the officers say among themselves. On many days, we received less than 100. Hunger began slowly, the way bad things often begin, almost unnoticed until suddenly it is everywhere. First, they reduced the bread rations. Then we began eating the horses that were still left, animals that not long before had pulled our artillery and our supplies. I remember the taste of that meat, tough and almost flavourless, and I also remember feeling ashamed that I was grateful for it, because back home those same animals would have seemed unthinkable to eat. Young Dieter, the recruit who had asked me about Anna's photograph, was one of the first to suffer from frostbite. One morning he took off his boot to change a damp sock and found that 2 toes on his right foot had turned black, hard, completely numb. He did not scream. He only stared at his own foot with an expression I had never seen before on such a young face. Not exactly fear, but something closer to disbelief, as if his body were telling a lie his mind still could not accept. They took him back to one of the few medical posts still operating, and I never learned what happened to him. That was another thing the battle taught me. People simply vanished from your life, without goodbye, without news, and you learned not to ask too many questions, because the answers were almost never good. Hans was still alive then, but he had grown so thin it hurt to look at him. One night, inside a basement where we slept packed together to share what little warmth our bodies could still produce, he asked me if I thought Anna was still waiting for me. I said yes, of course she was. He smiled a tired smile and said he wished he had someone waiting for him too. I never knew whether he meant it seriously or whether he was trying, once again, to lighten the weight of that night with a joke dressed up as sadness. Before the December cold arrived in full force, there was still a short stretch when the fighting eased a little, as if the city itself were catching its breath before the final blow that had not yet come. It was during those quieter days that I came to know another soldier in my company better, a man named Reinhardt, almost 40 years old, older than most of us, who had left a wife and 3 children on a farm near Hanover. Reinhardt did not speak much, but when he did, his words seemed to carry more weight than anyone else's. On one of those quieter nights, sitting near a small fire made from pieces of burned furniture inside a basement, he asked me whether I believed God could still see that place. I did not know how to answer. After a long silence, he answered himself. He said maybe God could see it, but that he had decided long ago to let men deal with what they had started on their own. I do not know whether that was faith or despair, wearing the face of faith. By then, I could no longer tell the difference inside myself. The cold that December reached levels I had not known a human body could endure. 30 degrees below zero, sometimes worse. Rifles jammed because ice formed inside the mechanism. The boots we wore, made for a much milder climate, did not protect our feet enough, and frostbite spread through the ranks. I saw men lose toes without even realizing it, until the pain arrived too late, when there was nothing left to do but amputate. By mid-December, word spread that Manstein had begun his rescue operation, advancing toward us from the south. For a few days, hope became almost physical, something you could feel in your chest. We counted the miles they said he still had to cover. 50 miles, then 40, 35. I remember one specific night that week, inside the basement where we slept, when an older soldier, a man named Vogel, who had fought in the Primera Guerra when he was still a young man, said something that stayed lodged in my memory for decades. He said he had seen whole armies die of hope before they died of bullets, and that the worst thing we could do in that moment was count the miles left before relief arrived, because every mile counted and not crossed was a small death inside. I did not want to believe him. I kept counting the miles anyway, because the alternative, having nothing to think about except hunger and cold, felt too unbearable. And then silence. No one explained why the advance had stopped. We only knew that it had stopped, and that the remaining miles never got any fewer. Years later, I would understand, when I was finally able to read about it in history books, already a free man, that Manstein's advance had been stopped by Soviet resistance and by the need to pull other German forces out of Caucaso before they were encircled as well. But in that December of 1942, inside that frozen basement, all we knew was that hope had stopped moving, and that it would not come back. What happened to my friend Hans? I have put off telling it for as long as I could, because telling it again means living that day again. It was early January. We were pulling back from a position near the Barricadi factory, a withdrawal the officers called a reorganization of the line, though all of us knew it was simply another step backward, one of many we had been taking since November. An artillery shell landed too close. Hans was 3 steps from me. I will not describe the details. I will only say that the last thing I heard from him, minutes before it happened, was that same whistle, soft, almost inaudible under the wind. The sound of that explosion still lives somewhere inside me. A dry blast followed by a brief silence, and then a sharp ringing in my ears that lasted the rest of the day. I felt the heat of the explosion before I even understood what had happened. A strange heat in the middle of so much cold. And then the smell. Sulphur, torn earth, and something else, something my body recognized before my mind agreed to recognize it. The snow around Hans was no longer white. I stayed kneeling there for a length of time I cannot measure, my hands numb from the cold, touching a coat that no longer protected anyone, trying to understand words my own mouth could not form. An officer grabbed me by the arm and shouted that we had to keep moving, that staying there meant dying too. I stood up. I kept walking. I cannot explain how a body keeps moving after something like that, but it does. Mine did, even though a part of me remained kneeling in that snow forever. January of 1943 was the month when we stopped being an army and became only men trying to survive one more day. The rations were almost gone. We ate whatever we could find. Scraps of horse meat, sometimes boiled leather, water melted from snow stained with soot. Dysentery and typhus spread through us as quickly as the cold. I saw men who had survived months of combat die, sitting against a wall, simply because their bodies could not take any more. Is there still a way out? The question remained, but by then almost no one pretended to believe the answer was yes. On January 10th, the Soviets launched a massive offensive to destroy what remained inside the encirclement once and for all, something the Soviet soldiers themselves called Opération Anel. Our line, already reduced to ragged remnants of entire divisions, was pushed deeper and deeper into the city, into a smaller and smaller space, the Potomnik airfield, from which a few planes still carried out the wounded, fell at the end of that month. After that, almost no one could leave that circle anymore, not even those too badly mutilated to keep fighting. I was wounded on January 20th, a piece of shrapnel cutting deep into my left leg near the knee. There was no real field hospital anymore, only basements packed with wounded men lying side by side, without enough anesthesia, without enough bandages, without enough doctors. I lay there among men who groaned softly, or who no longer groaned at all, listening to the sound of Soviet artillery drawing closer day after day. What would happen to me if that basement was taken before I could walk again? At the end of January, we heard that General Paulus had been promoted to Field Marshal. A soldier lying beside me laughed, a bitter laugh with no joy in it, and said he knew exactly what it meant. No German field marshal had ever surrendered, and that was why Hitler had promoted him, hoping he would choose death over surrender. I did not know whether that was true, but a few days later I learned that Paulus had surrendered anyway, on January 31st, 1943, inside the basement of a department store in the center of the city, the same building where his headquarters had been for weeks. I was not there when it happened. I was several blocks away, lying in that basement full of wounded men, when an officer came in shouting that resistance in the southern sector was over, that Paulus had surrendered, and that each group had to decide for itself what to do. Some of the men around me cried. Others fell into complete silence, as if words could no longer reach whatever was left inside them. I remember feeling more than anything else a tiredness so deep that the news of surrender almost did not hurt. It was as if my body had surrendered weeks earlier, and my mind was only now catching up to what the body already knew. On February 2nd, resistance in the northern sector of the city, near the tractor factory, also ended. The Battaglia di Stalingrado, as we came to know it, was over. I was captured that same day, along with a small group of wounded men. The Soviet soldiers who found us were not cruel, but they had no room to be gentle either. They barely had enough food for their own men, let alone prisoners from an army that had besieged their city for months. They formed us into columns, and we began walking out of the city toward prison camps in the interior of the Union Sovietica. That march, which historians would later call a death march, lasted for days that blur together in my memory like a single fog. We walked through the snow, many of us still wounded, nearly all of us sick, nearly all of us starving after weeks without proper food. The sound of that column of men was something I had never heard before. Not the firm steps of soldiers marching, but the constant dragging of worn-out boots, an almost liquid sound mixed with dry coughs and low moans no one had the strength to hide any more. The wind cut into our faces with such violence that our eyes watered, and the tears froze almost instantly on our eyelids. Those who fell and could not get back up were left behind. I saw it happen to men who had survived months of direct combat against tanks and artillery, only to die now from cold and exhaustion on a frozen road, without a single bullet involved. I remember one man, whose name I never knew, falling right in front of me. For 1 second our eyes met, and in his eyes there was a question I had no answer for. I kept walking. We all kept walking, because stopping meant becoming one more motionless shape in the snow, slowly covered by the snow that kept falling, indifferent to all of it. I survived that march. I cannot say exactly why. Maybe because Anna was in my mind the whole time, a fixed point of light inside a darkness that seemed endless. Maybe because my body, despite everything, still had some reserve left that others did not. Maybe it was only luck, that word soldiers use when they cannot explain why some men live and others die under the exact same conditions. I spent the following years in Soviet prison camps, first in a transit camp near Beketovka, then in more permanent camps in the interior of the country, where we were used as labour to rebuild roads and factories destroyed by the very war we had helped spread. I will not describe each of those places in detail, because that would be another story, almost as long as the battle itself. I will only say that of the roughly 91,000 German soldiers captured in Stalingrad, very few would return home. Most died in the months after capture, still too weakened to withstand typhus, dysentery, and the cold of the camps where we were taken. In the first weeks at Beketovka, I saw comrades die every day, lying side by side in a barrack without enough heat, while the Soviet guards, as exhausted and hungry as we were after months of siege, could barely bury the bodies before the snow covered them. It was in one of those camps that I met a man named Otto, a former elementary school teacher who had been drafted too late in the war to still believe anything the official speeches said. Otto had a habit of quietly reciting poems he claimed to have written from memory, without paper, without a pencil, kept only inside his head for years. I never asked whether those words were truly his, or belonged to some poet he had memorized back in school. It did not matter. What mattered was that, for a few minutes while he recited, the prison camp stopped being the only reality that existed. Otto died of typhus in the winter of 1944. I was the one who dug part of the trench where he was buried, along with 6 other men from the same barrack, on a morning when the ground was so hard with ice that every shovel stroke felt as if it tore a piece of ourselves out, along with the earth. I was one of the men who came back. I returned only in 1955, 12 years after that February when the city fell, when an agreement between the governments finally allowed the release of the last German prisoners of war still alive in the Union Sovietica. I was 35 years old when I stepped off that train at a station in Alemannia Occidental, and I barely recognized my own country. Anna had married another man 7 years earlier. I do not hold that against her. She waited as long as any reasonable person could wait for someone who might have been dead. My father had already passed away. My mother barely recognized me when she saw me, thin and aged in a way that the years alone could not explain. My brother Peter had become an engineer, just as he had always wanted, and it was he who helped me slowly put myself back together, in a country that was also trying to put itself back together. I never again became the same man who had walked out of that bakery in 1942. I learned to live with that, not to get over it. Those are different things. For decades, I told this story to almost no one, not even to the woman I would later come to know and love, not even to the children I had with her. They knew I had been in the war. They knew I had been a prisoner. But they never knew the details. Hans's whistle, Sergeant Brandt moaning in that courtyard, the men who fell in the snow during the march and never stood up again. I am writing this now, because I feel that if I do not write it, all of it will disappear with me, and no one will know that it truly happened. Not as a number in a war statistic, not as a line in a history book, but as something one man lived through, felt and carried for the rest of his life. I do not know whether there is a proper way to end a story like this. The war ended for me in a cold basement. With shrapnel in my leg and news of a surrender I had already felt in my body before I ever heard it with my ears. But one way or another, a part of me never left that city, never crossed back over that frozen river, and remains there even now, waiting in the snow to see whether there is still any way out.